The barrel pressed cold against Maribel's chest, but her hands didn't shake. 3 masked figures had burst through Sterling Vale's mahogany doors just minutes ago, shattering his perfect world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Now they stood in his living room, weapons drawn, eyes wild with desperation. But it wasn't the billionaire they were watching. Sterling Vale, the man who'd crushed Fortune 500 companies before breakfast, cowered behind his Italian leather couch. His $3,000 suit wrinkled with terror. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. The same hands that signed million-dollar deals now trembled like autumn leaves. Yet Maribel stood perfectly still. The lead robber's voice cracked through his ski mask. "Where's the safe, old man?" Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. No words came out. The master of corporate warfare had become a frightened child. "I asked you a question." The robber's finger tightened on the trigger pressed against Maribel's sternum. That's when something impossible happened. Maribel smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a please don't hurt me smile. A knowing smile that made the intruder's confidence waver. Her dark eyes held secrets that could topple kingdoms. Her calm presence filled the room like smoke, choking out the chaos. "You picked the wrong house, baby," she whispered, her voice steady as stone. The robber's hand actually shook. Here was a woman with a gun to her heart, and somehow she was the most dangerous person in the room. Sterling watched from his hiding spot, confusion mixing with his terror. This was his maid, the woman who folded his clothes and served his coffee. The woman he'd barely noticed for 3 years. Yet she stood facing death like a warrior princess while he, Sterling Vale, trembled in his own fortress. What did she know that he didn't? The answer would shatter everything he believed about power, courage, and the woman who'd been invisible in plain sight. But first, one of them wouldn't survive the next 60 seconds. Sterling Vale owned the world, but the world felt empty. His mansion sprawled across 12 acres of perfectly manicured Connecticut countryside, a monument to his ruthless climb from nobody to everything. Every room screamed wealth, hand-carved ceilings from Italian craftsmen, Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, wine cellars stocked with bottles older than democracy. Yet he ate dinner alone every night. The dining room table stretched 20 feet, designed for grand parties that never came. Sterling sat at one end, cutting his grass-fed steak in mechanical silence while shadows danced on walls lined with portraits of dead strangers, previous owners whose families had sold their legacy to the highest bidder. At 52, Sterling had everything money could buy and nothing money couldn't. His empire spanned 3 continents. Politicians returned his calls within minutes. Competitors feared his name whispered in boardroom corridors. But when he climbed those marble stairs each night, the mansion felt like a beautiful tomb. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 30 years building walls, around his business, his emotions, his life. Now those same walls trapped him inside his own success. Maribel had been the only constant for 3 years. She arrived each morning at 7 sharp, her soft humming filling the silence as she moved through his empty rooms like a ghost bringing life to the dead. She never asked personal questions. Never commented on his loneliness. Never looked at him with the fake sympathy that made his skin crawl. She simply existed in his space, making it feel less like a mausoleum. Sterling barely knew her story. She lived somewhere in Hartford. Had a daughter, maybe? He'd never bothered to ask. To him, she was furniture that could fold laundry, useful, reliable, forgettable. How wrong he'd been. Tonight, as he'd watched her face down armed killers with the calm of a seasoned soldier, Sterling realized he'd been living with a stranger. The woman who quietly scrubbed his toilets had depths he'd never imagined. Who was Maribel really? And why had she chosen to work for a man who treated her like wallpaper? The questions burned in his mind as sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer to his shattered kingdom. Soon, police would swarm his sanctuary, asking their own questions. But the biggest mystery wasn't why the robbers had come. It was why Maribel had stayed. Maribel Rodriguez knew what it felt like to be a ghost. Every morning, she unlocked Sterling's fortress with keys he'd handed her like an afterthought. She moved through his world of marble and gold, cleaning up the mess of a man who had everything but understood nothing. He never saw her, really saw her. When she polished his awards, he walked past like she was part of the furniture. When she prepared his meals, he ate in silence, scrolling his phone while she cleared dishes he'd barely touched. For 3 years, she'd been the shadow keeping his life together, invisible as the air he breathed. But Maribel saw everything. She noticed how he stood at his bedroom window each night, staring into the darkness like a prisoner watching freedom from behind bars. She heard him pace the halls at 2 a.m., his footsteps echoing through rooms that should have been filled with laughter and life. The man had built an empire, but he'd forgotten how to build a home. Maribel understood loneliness. She'd raised her daughter Sophia alone after her husband walked out when the cancer bills got too high. Worked 3 jobs while earning her nursing degree at night. Scraped together rent payments in a Hartford apartment where the heat barely worked and the neighbors fought through paper-thin walls. Yet somehow her cramped 2-bedroom felt more alive than Sterling's 12-acre mansion. Sophia was in college now, pre-med at UConn, following her mother's footsteps into healing. Every month, Maribel sent half her earnings to cover what the scholarships wouldn't. She ate ramen for dinner so her daughter could focus on studying instead of working. That's why she stayed. Not because she enjoyed being invisible to a billionaire who treated her like expensive wallpaper. But because Sophia's dreams required sacrifice, and Maribel had never met a sacrifice she wouldn't make for her child. Still, she wondered what Sterling would say if he knew his quiet maid had pulled bullets out of gang members in Hartford General's emergency room. If he knew she'd talked suicidal teenagers off ledges during her volunteer shifts at the crisis center. If he knew this simple cleaning lady spoke 4 languages and had seen more of life's raw edges in 1 year than he'd seen in 52. Would he finally see her as human? The irony burned in her chest. Sterling surrounded himself with advisors, lawyers, and executives who told him what he wanted to hear. But the person who understood him best, who saw through his wealth to the broken man underneath, was the woman he paid to be invisible. She'd watched him for 3 years, studying his patterns like a scientist examining a specimen. His fake smiles during video calls. His genuine exhaustion when he thought no one was looking. The way he touched his wedding ring finger even though he'd never been married. Sterling Vale was the loneliest rich man in America. And Maribel was the only person who cared. Money couldn't buy a soul, but it could definitely hide the fact that you'd lost yours. Sterling's mornings started with stock reports and ended with sleeping pills. Everything in between was a carefully orchestrated performance. The ruthless CEO who crushed competition without blinking. But performances exhausted the performer. He'd fired 3,000 employees last quarter to boost profits. Signed the papers in his corner office, watching tiny figures leave the building through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Wall Street cheered. His board applauded. Sterling felt nothing. That night, he'd stood in his marble shower for 40 minutes, letting scalding water punish skin that couldn't feel shame anymore. Meanwhile, 30 miles away, Maribel was teaching Sunday school to kids whose parents worked the jobs Sterling had eliminated. She knew nothing about quarterly reports or shareholder value. She knew about Timmy's father who'd started drinking after the layoffs. About Maria's mother who now worked 2 jobs to pay rent. She knew about consequences Sterling would never see. The contrast was staggering. Sterling owned art worth millions but couldn't remember the last time beauty moved him to tears. Maribel hung her daughter's crayon drawings on a refrigerator older than democracy and felt pride swell in her chest every time she looked at them. He attended charity galas where wealthy people wrote checks to feel better about themselves. She volunteered at soup kitchens, ladling hope into bowls alongside the food. Sterling's calendar was packed with meetings that meant nothing. Maribel's free time was spent reading to elderly patients who had no visitors, holding hands that doctors were too busy to touch. Which one of them was really wealthy? The question haunted Sterling in moments of rare honesty, usually at 3 a.m. when insomnia forced him to confront the hollow man in his bathroom mirror. He'd built his empire by stepping on others, climbing their broken dreams like rungs on a ladder to nowhere. Maribel had built her life by lifting others up, even when she had nothing left to give. She possessed something Sterling had traded away long ago, a conscience that still worked. And deep down, buried beneath decades of corporate ruthlessness, Sterling knew the truth that would eventually destroy him. The woman he barely noticed was everything he'd forgotten how to be. The warning started 3 days before the robbery, but Sterling was too important to notice. Tuesday morning, Maribel found the security system's back door ajar. Not broken, just cracked open like someone had tested it. She mentioned it while serving Sterling's coffee, her voice careful and concerned. "Probably the wind," he muttered, never looking up from his tablet. Wednesday evening, the groundskeeper called about strange tire tracks near the property's east gate. Deep treads that didn't match Sterling's fleet of luxury cars or the service vehicles. Someone had been watching, planning, measuring distances. Sterling was in Dubai closing a deal. The message went to voicemail. Thursday night. Maribel's daughter called, voice tight with worry. Mama, some guy was asking about you at the grocery store. Wanted to know where you work, what time you leave. I told him nothing but. Sophia's words trailed into fearful silence. Maribel felt ice form in her stomach. In her years working emergency rooms, she'd learned to recognize when violence was circling, looking for a place to land. The signs were always there, most people just refused to see them. But Sterling wasn't most people. He was supposed to be smarter. That evening she tried again. Found him in his study, surrounded by legal documents and empty whiskey glasses. Mr. Vale, I think someone might be. Not now, Maribel. His tone carried the dismissive edge that made board members shrink. Whatever it is, handle it yourself. The words stung more than they should have. 3 years of invisible service and she was still just the help to him. Her concerns didn't merit his precious attention. If she'd been white, would he have listened? The question burned, but Maribel pushed it down. She had bigger problems than Sterling's unconscious prejudices. Someone was hunting and her boss was too proud to admit he might be prey. Friday brought the final warning. Maribel arrived early as always and found her key wouldn't turn. Someone had tampered with the locks, subtle work that required skill and planning. Her hands shook as she called Sterling's cell. The locks are wrong, she whispered, standing in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone's been here. Jesus, Maribel, at 6 a.m. Can't this wait? No, it can't. Something's coming. I can feel it. Sterling's laugh was sharp and condescending. Feel it? What are you, a psychic now? Look, if you're having problems with the house, call the handyman. That's what I pay him for. The line went dead. Maribel stared at her phone, fury and fear warring in her chest. She'd spent 3 years protecting this man's comfort, anticipating his needs, keeping his world running smoothly. But when danger finally came knocking, her voice meant nothing. Sterling Vale thought his money made him untouchable. He was about to learn that predators don't read bank statements. And the woman he'd dismissed as paranoid was the only thing standing between him and a violence that would reshape both their lives forever. Some storms can't be bought off or ignored. This one was already at the door. At 9:47 p.m., Sterling Vale's fortress became a tomb. The power died without warning. Every light, every security camera, every electronic lock that kept the outside world at bay. Darkness swallowed the mansion like black water filling a sinking ship. Sterling looked up from his evening whiskey, annoyed more than alarmed. Power outages happened. Generators kicked in. Problems got solved with phone calls and money. But the backup generators stayed silent. Maribel was in the kitchen, finishing the dinner dishes by the window's faint moonlight. Her hands stilled in the soapy water as instinct screamed danger. This wasn't an accident. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. She'd seen this before in Hartford, the calm before predators struck. Outside, 3 shadows moved across Sterling's manicured lawn with practiced silence. They'd studied this property for weeks, mapped every entrance, timed every patrol. The power grid was their first conquest. The security system was already compromised. Now came the easy part. The lead figure, tall, lean, desperate, carried tools that could open any door money couldn't keep closed. Behind him, 2 younger men clutched weapons with the shaky confidence of first-time killers trying to prove themselves. They needed Sterling's money more than they feared his reputation. The Eastern Service door surrendered without a fight. Their footsteps whispered across marble floors that had never known violence. Past the dining room where Sterling ate alone. Through the hall lined with portraits of strangers. Toward the study where their target sat in darkness, still believing money made him untouchable. Maribel heard them first. 3 years of cleaning this maze had taught her every sound the mansion could make. The whisper of forced entry. The careful placement of unfamiliar feet. The held breath of hunters closing in on prey. Her phone was upstairs. The landline was dead with the power. Sterling sat 40 feet away, but he might as well have been on another planet. She had seconds to choose. Run to the servants' quarters and lock the door. Escape through the kitchen's back exit. Save herself and let Sterling face whatever was coming alone. Or stay. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of cleaning up his messes while he barely acknowledged her existence. 3 years of watching a man who had everything appreciate nothing. Why should she risk her life for someone who wouldn't cross the street to save hers? The answer came from somewhere deeper than logic. Because running made her like them, the predators who took what they wanted and left wreckage behind. Because Sophia was studying medicine to heal people, not abandon them. Because the woman who'd pulled bullets out of gang members couldn't walk away from violence, even when the victim was a man who'd never earned her loyalty. Maribel dried her hands on her apron and moved toward Sterling's study. The intruders were already inside. She could hear Sterling's voice, commanding, arrogant, still believing his wealth was armor against bullets. The robbers' responses were sharp and hungry, desperation making them dangerous. What happened next would test everything she'd learned about courage in emergency rooms and crisis centers. Some people ran toward gunfire. Others discovered they'd been running toward it their whole lives. "Gentlemen, let's discuss this like civilized people." Sterling's voice carried the same tone he used in hostile takeovers, calm, controlled, convinced that every problem had a price tag. Even with guns pointed at his chest, he couldn't imagine a situation money wouldn't fix. The lead robber's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "Civilized." The word dripped with venom. "You fire my father after 20 years, and now you want civilized?" Sterling's confident expression flickered. He fired so many people that faces blurred together. Numbers on spreadsheets, obstacles to profit margins. But this voice carried personal hatred that made his blood run cold. "Look, whatever your father earned, I'll double it. Triple it." Sterling reached for his wallet with movements that seemed casual but screamed desperation. "This doesn't have to get messy." "Messy?" The second robber, younger, angrier, stepped forward with his weapon raised. "My dad put a gun in his mouth because of you. Called that messy too?" The words hit Sterling like physical blows. Suddenly, the abstract consequences of his corporate decisions stood before him with faces, voices, and very real weapons. These weren't random criminals looking for easy money. They were ghosts of his choices come home to haunt him. "I have 10,000 in cash upstairs," Sterling said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Swiss accounts with millions more. Wire transfers that take 5 minutes. Name your price." The lead robber's eyes blazed with fury that money couldn't touch. "You think this is about money? You destroyed lives like they were nothing, and now you think throwing cash at us makes it right?" He pressed his gun against Sterling's temple. "Some damage can't be bought off, old man." Sterling's world tilted. For 30 years, every problem had surrendered to sufficient financial pressure. Lawsuits disappeared. Politicians voted his way. Competitors sold out or got crushed. Money was the only language he'd needed to speak. But these men spoke fluency in pain. "Please be reasonable," Sterling whispered, his commanding presence crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. "I'm worth $40 billion. Whatever you want, I can get it. What we want is watching you beg." The third robber's voice cracked with emotion. "My mom cleaned office buildings after you killed her job. Worked until her hands bled just to keep our lights on. You want to know what we want?" Sterling nodded frantically, still believing negotiation was possible. "We want you to know what it feels like to lose everything." The gun barrels didn't waver. Sterling's offers meant nothing to men who'd already lost what mattered most. For the first time in his life, Sterling Vale faced a problem money couldn't solve. And the solution terrified him more than death itself. That's when Maribel stepped into the room. But she wasn't alone. Behind her cowered Elena Vasquez, 19 years old, 3 weeks into her first job as Sterling's evening cook. The girl had been preparing tomorrow's meals when the lights died, too scared to run, too young to understand that some situations had no good endings. Maribel had found her hyperventilating in the pantry, tears streaming down her face as violence echoed through the mansion. Instead of escaping alone, Maribel had taken the girl's trembling hand and whispered the only truth that mattered: "Stay behind me. No matter what happens, stay behind me." Now they stood in the study's doorway, a middle-aged maid and a terrified teenager facing 3 armed men who'd already decided Sterling's fate. "Well, well." The lead robber's voice carried sick amusement. "More witnesses. This keeps getting better." Elena's sobs filled the silence like breaking glass. Her whole body shook with terror that made the gunman smile with predatory satisfaction. Here was the fear they'd come looking for. But Maribel didn't shake. She stepped forward, placing herself between the weapons and Elena, her movements deliberate and calm. Her dark eyes met the lead robber's gaze without flinching, holding steady in a way that made him genuinely uncomfortable. "Let the girl go," Maribel said quietly. "She's got nothing to do with this. Nobody leaves until we're done here, lady. Sit down and shut up or join your boss on the floor." Maribel didn't move. Didn't sit. Didn't shut up. She's 19. Just started working here. Sends money to her family in El Salvador. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen real violence and refused to be intimidated by its pale imitations. "You want Sterling, take Sterling. But that girl walks out of here safe." The robbers exchanged confused glances. They'd expected screaming, begging, the collapse of order that fear usually brought. Instead, they faced a woman who talked to them like she was the one in control. "What makes you think you get to make demands?" The second robber pointed his weapon at Maribel's chest, close enough that she could smell his nervous sweat. "Because I know who you are." Maribel's words dropped like stones into still water. "Tommy Rodriguez. Your father worked Sterling's Hartford plant until the layoffs. Your mother cleans offices downtown now. Your little sister goes to St. Augustine Elementary." Tommy's face went white behind his mask. "How could she possibly know? I volunteer at the community center. Helped your mom fill out unemployment forms. Your sister's in my Sunday school class." Maribel's voice stayed gentle, but her eyes burned with purpose. "Sweet girl. Draws pictures of butterflies. Dreams of becoming a teacher." The gun in Tommy's hand suddenly felt heavier than concrete. This wasn't some random rich person's maid. This was someone from his world. Someone who knew his family, his pain, his story. "You think she'd be proud of what you're doing right now?" Maribel asked. Behind her, Elena's sobs quieted. Even in her terror, the young woman could sense something powerful happening. The collision between violence and conscience, hatred and humanity. Sterling watched from the floor, stunned into silence. The woman he'd barely noticed for 3 years was dismantling armed killers with nothing but moral authority and personal connection. Who the hell was Maribel Rodriguez? And why was she braver than everyone else in the room combined? Tommy's hesitation lasted 3 heartbeats too long. Enough of this therapy session. The lead robber, who'd been silent during Maribel's moral assault, grabbed Tommy's shoulder and shoved him aside. "We didn't come here to get lectured by the help." But something in his voice had changed. The confident authority was cracking, replaced by desperation that made him more dangerous than ever. "You're right about one thing, lady," he continued, his weapon trained on Maribel's steady gaze. "We're not random criminals. We know this house better than its owner does." Sterling's blood froze. Random robbery was terrifying but comprehensible. This felt like something far worse, a violation that reached into his most private spaces. "The wine cellar with the hidden panic room behind the 1947 Bordeaux," the leader continued, his voice growing more confident with each revelation. "The floor safe under the Persian rug in your bedroom. The backup cash stash in the library's fake first edition books." Each detail hit Sterling like a physical blow. These weren't secrets you learned from watching a house for a few days. This was inside information, intimate knowledge that required months of access. "Surprised, Mr. Vale?" The robber's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Did you really think the people who clean your toilets and trim your hedges were invisible? That we didn't see where you hid your treasures while we scrubbed your floors?" Sterling's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. His groundskeeper had worked for him for 5 years. The previous cleaning service before Maribel had access to every room. His personal assistant knew his routines better than he did. Who had sold him out? "Marcus Chin," Maribel whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of recognition and disappointment. The lead robber's mask couldn't hide his flinch. Hearing his name spoken aloud stripped away the last of his anonymity, making him human again instead of a faceless threat. "You know this one too?" Sterling asked, his voice hollow with betrayal. "He worked landscaping here 2 years ago," Maribel replied, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Got fired for showing up drunk. Left threatening to make you pay. I worked for you for 3 years." Marcus exploded, his careful composure finally cracking. 3 years of watching you waste money on art you never look at while my family lost our house. 3 years of yes, Mr. Vale, and right away, Mr. Vale, while you treated me like I was part of the scenery. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Marcus had recruited Tommy and the third man, other casualties of Sterling's corporate machine. They'd planned this for months, using intimate knowledge of security systems, daily routines, and hiding places that only former employees would know. This wasn't just robbery. It was revenge served with surgical precision. "So what's the plan, Marcus?" Maribel asked, her voice steady despite the gun pointed at her heart. "Kill us all and disappear with Sterling's money? Think that'll bring your house back? Fix your family?" "It'll feel good," Marcus snarled, but his voice carried doubt that hadn't been there before. "Will it? Or will it just create more victims? More families destroyed by violence?" Elena whimpered behind Maribel, and the sound seemed to echo through the mansion like a ghost's whisper. Here was innocence caught in the crossfire of Sterling's past sins and Marcus's present fury. The question hanging in the air was no longer whether anyone would survive the night. It was whether anyone would emerge unchanged. Maribel made her move when Marcus's attention shifted to Sterling's cowering form. "The safe combination," Marcus demanded, pressing his weapon against Sterling's temple. "Now or the maid gets a bullet." That's when Maribel did something that defied every survival instinct screaming in her brain. She stepped forward. Not back. Not aside. Forward, directly into Marcus's line of fire, placing herself between the gun and Sterling like a human shield made of pure courage. "You want to shoot someone, shoot me," she said quietly. "But you're not touching that girl, and you're not murdering a man in cold blood while I'm breathing." The silence that followed was more terrifying than screaming. Marcus's weapon trembled in his grip. He'd come here prepared to rob, maybe even prepared to kill if cornered. But he hadn't prepared for someone to volunteer as a sacrifice, to look death in the face with calm acceptance that made his own rage seem petty and small. "Lady, you've got 5 seconds to move or what?" Maribel's voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced down death before and found it less frightening than living without principles. "You'll prove you're exactly what he thinks you are? Another violent criminal who solves problems with bullets." "I'm not," Marcus started, but his protest died in his throat. "Then prove it. Walk away. Take your friends and leave before this goes somewhere none of us can come back from." Behind Maribel, Sterling watched in stunned silence as his maid, his invisible, forgettable maid, transformed into something magnificent and terrifying. This woman was willing to die for him, and he couldn't even remember her daughter's name. But Marcus wasn't backing down. 3 years of rage and humiliation had built a fire in his chest that Maribel's words couldn't extinguish. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance, lady. Move or—" Maribel lunged. Not away from the gun, but toward it, her hands reaching for Marcus's weapon with the desperate speed of someone who knew that hesitation meant death. Her movement caught him off guard. Who attacks someone pointing a gun at them? And for a split second his surprise gave her an advantage. Her fingers closed around the barrel just as his reflexes kicked in. The gun went off. The sound exploded through the mansion like thunder, echoing off marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Elena screamed. Sterling's ears rang with a high-pitched whine that made the world sound like it was drowning. But Maribel was still standing. The bullet had gone wide, punching a hole in the wall inches from Sterling's head. Plaster dust drifted down like snow while Maribel and Marcus fought for control of the weapon, their struggle violent and desperate. She was stronger than she looked. Years of lifting patients in emergency rooms had built muscle that her quiet demeanor concealed. But Marcus was younger, taller, and fueled by rage that made him vicious. He backhanded her across the face with his free hand. The blow sent Maribel stumbling backward, blood streaming from her split lip. But she didn't release the gun. If anything, her grip tightened with the stubborn determination of someone who'd never learned to quit. "Shoot her," Tommy yelled, his own weapon trained on the struggling pair. "End this." But Tommy couldn't get a clean shot without risking Marcus. And something in Maribel's eyes, the complete absence of fear, the presence of something larger than self-preservation, made his finger freeze on the trigger. Sterling watched the woman who cleaned his toilets fight 3 armed men with nothing but moral courage and fierce determination. And for the first time in 30 years, he felt genuine admiration for another human being. She was everything he'd forgotten how to be. Everything he'd never learned to value. Everything money couldn't buy, power couldn't command, and wealth couldn't create. She was real. Sterling had never seen courage before. Real courage, not the boardroom theater he'd mistaken for bravery his entire life. Watching Maribel fight for his worthless life while bleeding from her split lip, Sterling finally understood the difference between having power and being powerful. He possessed $40 billion and cowered on his marble floor like a beaten dog. She earned $30,000 a year and faced down killers like an avenging angel. Who was really wealthy? The question burned through his mind as Maribel and Marcus continued their desperate struggle for the weapon. Every corporate victory Sterling had ever celebrated suddenly felt hollow, meaningless, pathetic compared to this woman's willingness to sacrifice herself for others. When had he last risked anything for someone else? When had he last stood up for what was right instead of what was profitable? Never. Not once. Not ever. Sterling Vale, master of the universe, crusher of competition, builder of empires, had lived his entire adult life as a coward who confused money with meaning. Help her. Elena sobbed from the corner, her young voice cutting through Sterling's paralysis. Please, somebody help her. But Sterling remained frozen, watching Maribel bleed for him while he calculated the safest response. Even now, with a gun inches from his face and a hero dying to save him, his first instinct was self-preservation. What kind of man was he? The answer stared back at him from the reflection in his study's dark windows, a hollow shell of expensive suits and empty achievements, a billionaire who'd never learned the price of anything valuable. Maribel stumbled backward as Marcus landed another vicious blow, her grip on the weapon loosening. Blood ran down her chin, but her eyes never wavered from his face. She was losing this fight and they all knew it. But she wasn't surrendering. Is this what your father would want? She gasped, still trying to reach Marcus's conscience even as he overpowered her. Violence? Murder? Is this the legacy he worked 20 years to build? Don't talk about my father. Marcus roared, finally wrenching the gun from her bleeding hands. Maribel fell to her knees, weaponless and vulnerable, but still placing herself between Marcus and the others. Even defeated, even powerless, she remained a shield. Sterling watched this display of selfless heroism and felt something crack inside his chest. 30 years of carefully constructed emotional armor shattering like glass. This woman was magnificent. Not in the way that money made people impressive, through designer clothes or luxury cars or exclusive addresses. She was magnificent in a way that no amount of wealth could purchase. The magnificence of someone who'd rather die than compromise her principles. Sterling owned priceless art that moved him to nothing. Maribel possessed a soul that moved mountains. He controlled billions in assets. She controlled her own character. He commanded respect through fear and financial power. She earned it through moral authority and genuine compassion. For the first time in his life, Sterling Vale was in the presence of someone truly rich. And she was dying to save a man who'd spent 3 years treating her like furniture. The irony was so perfect it would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. Sterling finally understood what he'd been missing his entire life. Not more money, not greater power, not bigger achievements. He'd been missing a reason to be worth saving. Maribel had found hers in service to others. Sterling was still looking for his. But time was running out for both of them. Marcus raised his weapon toward Maribel's bleeding form, but the third robber, silent until now, grabbed his wrist. Wait. The voice was calm, educated, carrying authority that made Marcus freeze mid-motion. She served her purpose. The leader stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. Unlike his companions, who radiated desperate rage, this man possessed the cold calculation of someone executing a carefully planned strategy. He reached up and pulled off his mask. Sterling's world collapsed. Hello, Sterling. The face revealed was sharp-featured, intelligent, marked by years of bitterness that had carved lines around piercing gray eyes. Did you miss me? Cashin Holt. Sterling's former head of acquisitions. The architect of 3 major deals that had made Sterling billions. The man who'd built half of Sterling's empire with brilliant strategy and ruthless execution. The man Sterling had destroyed to protect his own reputation. Impossible, Sterling whispered, his voice barely audible above Elena's quiet sobs. You're in prison. 25 years. Financial fraud. You. I was in prison. Cashin's smile was razor sharp. Amazing what good behavior and a sympathetic parole board can accomplish. Been out for 6 months now. Had plenty of time to plan this reunion. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't a random robbery or even simple revenge from fired employees. This was surgical justice planned by someone who understood Sterling's weaknesses better than Sterling understood them himself. Cashin had recruited Marcus and Tommy, both casualties of Sterling's corporate machine, but he was the mastermind. The insider knowledge, the systematic approach, the psychological warfare that had been building for days. This was personal. "You set me up," Sterling said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The fraud charges. The federal investigation. That was you. That was you, Sterling." Cashin's voice carried the patience of a teacher explaining simple concepts to a slow student. "I just made sure the authorities found what you were already hiding." Amazing how quickly the SEC moves when someone provides detailed evidence of securities violations. Maribel struggled to her feet, blood still trickling from her split lip, her dark eyes moving between Sterling and Cashin as she processed this new dynamic. The robbery had just become something far more complex. A confrontation between former partners who destroyed each other in different ways. "I gave you everything," Cashin continued, circling Sterling like a predator savoring the hunt. "Brilliant deals. Massive profits. I made you richer than God, and you threw me to the wolves the moment things got complicated." "The Meridian deal was illegal," Sterling protested, his voice cracking with strain. "You knew the risks. When the investigation started, I had to." "You had to save yourself." Cashin's interruption was sharp as breaking glass. "Couldn't let your golden reputation get tarnished. Better to sacrifice your partner than admit you knew exactly what we were doing." Sterling's mouth opened and closed without sound. Because Cashin was right. The Meridian acquisition had been built on insider information and market manipulation that both men had orchestrated. When federal investigators got close, Sterling had fed them Cashin's name to protect himself. One phone call. One strategic betrayal. One former partner destroyed to preserve Sterling's empire. 25 years became 8 with good behavior, Cashin said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. 8 years to plan. 8 years to watch your empire grow fat on deals I designed. 8 years to identify everyone you destroyed along the way. He gestured toward Marcus and Tommy. "Turns out you've made a lot of enemies, Sterling. Wasn't hard to find volunteers for tonight's festivities." Maribel watched this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't random violence or simple robbery. This was the past coming to collect debts that Sterling thought he'd buried with money and lawyers. "What do you want?" Sterling asked, though he already feared the answer. Cashin's smile was colder than winter moonlight. "Everything you took from me. Your reputation. Your empire. Your peace of mind." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Your life." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sterling had spent 8 years believing his betrayal was buried in the past. He was about to learn that some graves were too shallow to hold the dead. "You want to know what 8 years in federal prison teaches you, Sterling?" Cashin's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd had decades to perfect his hatred. "It teaches you patience, research, the beauty of comprehensive revenge." He pulled a tablet from his jacket. Somehow he'd managed to keep it during the struggle, and the screen glowed to life in the mansion's darkness. "Marcus Rodriguez." He gestured toward the young man still holding the gun on Maribel. "Father worked your Hartford plant for 15 years. Dedicated employee. Perfect attendance. Then you moved production overseas to save 12 cents per unit. Laid off 400 people 3 weeks before Christmas." Marcus's jaw tightened as Cashin recited his family's destruction like reading a grocery list. "Antonio couldn't find work for 8 months. Started drinking. Lost the house. Died in a car accident driving drunk from another job interview that went nowhere." Cashin's eyes never left Sterling's face. "Widow and 3 kids evicted 2 months later." Sterling felt ice forming in his stomach. He remembered the Hartford closure, a brilliant cost-saving measure that had boosted quarterly profits by 18%. Wall Street had loved it. He'd never thought about the 400 families it destroyed. Tommy Chin. Cashin scrolled to another file. "Father worked your Shanghai facility. Injured his back lifting machinery you refused to replace because it was cost-prohibitive. No workers' compensation because technically he was employed by a subcontractor. No medical coverage. Family sold everything to pay for surgery that didn't work." Tommy's weapon trembled in his grip as his father's pain was laid bare for everyone to witness. Chin Sr. spent his last 2 years bedridden, watching his medical bills destroy everything he'd built. Died owing more money than he'd earned in his entire life. Cashin's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Medical bankruptcy. The American dream, Sterling style. Stop, Sterling whispered, but his voice carried no authority. What? Getting uncomfortable? We're just getting started. Cashin scrolled again. Elena Vasquez. Yes, I know about your newest employee too. Her family fled El Salvador because of the drug violence. You want to know what fuels that violence? Money laundering through legitimate businesses. Like your Central American shipping operations. Elena whimpered from the corner, not understanding the English but sensing her family's pain being weaponized. Your clean cargo ships move more than coffee beans, Sterling. The cartels pay premium rates for transportation, and you take their money without asking questions. Blood money that funds the violence Elena's family ran from. Cashin's voice dropped to a whisper. She's serving dinner to the man who helped destroy her homeland. The accusations hit Sterling like physical blows. Each revelation exposed another layer of willful ignorance, another decision to prioritize profits over people. He'd built his empire by not asking questions, not seeing consequences, not caring about the wreckage left behind. And Maribel. Cashin turned toward the bleeding woman who still stood protectively near Elena. Her husband Miguel died because your insurance subsidiary routinely denies cancer treatments to cut costs. Something about experimental procedures and coverage limitations. Remember that policy? Maribel's eyes widened with recognition and fresh pain. The insurance battles during Miguel's final months. The treatments denied. The medications deemed unnecessary. The system designed to let people die quietly to protect profit margins. Sterling had signed that policy himself. Every person in this room has been destroyed by your empire, Cashin said, his tablet casting eerie shadows across his satisfied face. Tonight, you get to meet your victims. The mansion's silence was broken only by Elena's quiet sobs and the sound of Sterling's world crumbling around him. Justice had many faces. Tonight they all wore masks. Sterling's mind raced through calculations like a computer processing data. 30 years of hostile takeovers had taught him that every problem had a price, every enemy could be bought, every crisis could be managed with sufficient financial pressure. Even this one. You want justice? Fine. Sterling forced confidence into his voice, reaching for the arrogance that had carried him through countless corporate battles. Let's talk numbers. Real numbers. He struggled to his feet, straightening his expensive suit like armor against the accusations swirling around him. Blood from Maribel's split lips stained his marble floor, but Sterling's focus was laser-sharp on the only language he'd ever truly mastered. Money. Marcus, your father earned what, $50,000 a year? I'll give you $5 million. Gosh. Tonight. Sterling's voice grew stronger as he found familiar ground. Tommy, medical bills destroyed your family? I'll pay them off. Every penny. Plus $10 million for your pain and suffering. The robbers exchanged uncertain glances. $5 million was more than they'd see in 10 lifetimes of honest work. Elena, your family needs safety? I'll sponsor their immigration. Green cards. Citizenship. A house in the suburbs. Private schools for your siblings. Sterling was hitting his stride now, the master negotiator finding his rhythm. Maribel, your husband's medical bills? I'll establish a foundation in his name. Cancer research. Free treatments for families like yours. For a moment, the room's energy shifted. Even Cashin seemed momentarily thrown by the sheer audacity of Sterling's offer. $50 million, Sterling continued, his voice ringing with the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Split 5 ways. That's $10 million each. More money than your family's lost. More than enough to start over. Clean slate. Fresh beginning. But Cashin's laughter cut through Sterling's momentum like a blade through silk. Still don't get it, do you? Cashin shook his head with genuine amazement. After everything I just showed you, you still think this is about money? Everything's about money, Sterling insisted, desperation creeping into his confident facade. Name your price. 100 million. 200. I can wire it before sunrise. My price. Cashin stepped closer, his gray eyes burning with 8 years of concentrated fury. My price was 25 years of my life. My marriage that ended while I was in prison. My daughter who won't return my phone calls because she's ashamed of her father. My reputation in ruins while you got richer on deals I created. Sterling's confidence began to crack. I can fix that. Publicize your contributions. Clear your name. Restoration of reputation is just another business problem. Shut up. Cashin's roar echoed through the mansion like thunder. You think you can buy forgiveness? Purchase redemption? Pay your way out of judgment. He grabbed Sterling by his expensive lapels and slammed him against the wall. Marcus's father is dead. Tommy's family is broken. Maribel's husband is buried. Elena's homeland is destroyed. You think money resurrects the dead? Rebuilds shattered lives? Undoes decades of suffering? Sterling's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in his adult life, his financial solutions felt pathetically inadequate. You know what your problem is, Sterling? Cashin's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than screaming. You think wealth equals worth. You think because you can afford anything you can fix everything. But some damage can't be bought off. He released Sterling, who slumped against the wall like a broken puppet. The families you destroyed aren't looking for payouts. They're looking for accountability. The children orphaned by your greed don't want your money, they want their parents back. The communities you poisoned can't be healed with checkbooks. Sterling stared at the faces surrounding him. Marcus's rage, Tommy's grief, Elena's terror, Maribel's quiet strength. Each one represented consequences he'd never considered, damage he'd never acknowledged, pain he'd never bothered to measure. His empire was built on their broken dreams. His fortune was funded by their suffering. His success was purchased with their failures. And money, all the money in the world, couldn't change that fundamental equation. So what happens now? Sterling asked, his voice barely audible. Cashin's smile was colder than death itself. Now you learn what it feels like to lose everything that matters. The negotiations were over. Justice was about to begin. That's when Maribel spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. You're both wrong. Every eye in the room turned toward the bloodied woman who'd been forgotten in the clash between Sterling's desperation and Cashin's fury. She stood slowly, wiping blood from her split lip with the back of her hand, her dark eyes blazing with something that made even the armed men step back. Cashin, you think this is justice? She gestured toward the weapons, the fear, the violence that had poisoned the mansion's air. You think terrorizing innocent people makes you righteous? Elena's 19 years old. What did she do to deserve this nightmare? Cashin's confident expression flickered. He'd orchestrated this confrontation to force Sterling to face his victims, but he hadn't expected one of those victims to turn on him. And you, Maribel continued, her attention shifting to Sterling with laser intensity. Sitting there calculating payments like this is another business transaction. Like you can write a check for my husband's life. Sterling flinched as if she'd struck him. You want to know what your insurance policy cost me? Maribel's voice grew stronger, carrying pain that had been buried for years. Miguel fought cancer for 18 months. 18 months of watching treatments get denied while your company's computers calculated whether his life was worth the expense. She stepped closer to Sterling and he couldn't meet her gaze. The experimental therapy that might have saved him? Denied. Too expensive. The pain medication that would have let him sleep? Denied. Not covered. The hospital bed so he could die at home with dignity? Denied. Medical equipment rental exceeded your policy limits. Each word hit Sterling like a physical blow. These weren't abstract business decisions anymore, they were the specific details of how his empire had tortured an innocent man to death. So Miguel died in agony on our living room couch, apologizing to me for costing too much money. A good man who worked construction for 20 years, paid his premiums every month, died believing he was a burden instead of a human being your company murdered with paperwork. Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. What could he possibly say to that? You know what the worst part was? Maribel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more power than screaming. The day after Miguel's funeral, your company sent a grief counseling brochure. A pamphlet about moving forward after loss. Like they were doing me a favor after they killed my husband. She laughed, but the sound held no humor, only bitter recognition of the system's cruel absurdity. So don't you dare sit there offering money like it fixes anything. Don't you dare think writing checks erases the nights I held Miguel while he screamed from pain your company could have stopped. Don't you dare believe your wealth washes the blood off your hands. Sterling felt something breaking inside his chest. 30 years of carefully constructed justifications crumbling under the weight of one woman's truth. He'd always known his business decisions had consequences. He just never let himself see the faces of those consequences. Now he couldn't look away. "I worked for you for 3 years," Maribel continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 3 years of cleaning the house bought with money stained by my husband's blood. 3 years of serving meals to the man whose company killed the love of my life. "Then why?" Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did you stay? Why did you save me tonight?" Maribel wiped her eyes, smearing blood and tears across her cheek. "Because someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to choose forgiveness over revenge, healing over hatred. Miguel taught me that before he died, that adding more pain to the world doesn't honor the pain that's already been caused." She looked at Cashin, then back at Sterling. "You both think this is about what you deserve. But it's not. It's about what the world deserves. And the world deserves better than more violence, more revenge, more families destroyed by men who think their pain justifies inflicting pain on others." The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling stared at this woman who had every reason to hate him, every justification for revenge, every right to walk away and let Cashin do whatever he planned. Instead, she'd risked her life to protect him, not because he deserved it but because mercy was stronger than justice. She was everything his empire had tried to crush. And somehow, impossibly, she'd survived with her humanity intact. The question burning in Sterling's mind wasn't whether he deserved her sacrifice. It was whether he could possibly learn to be worthy of it. Something shattered inside Sterling Vale. Not his composure, that had been cracking for hours. Not his pride. Cashin had already beaten that to death with brutal truths. Something deeper broke, something fundamental that had been holding his world together for 30 years. His sense of who he was. "Stop," Sterling whispered, then louder, "Stop." The word echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Cashin with his tablet of victims, Marcus with his weapon trained on Maribel, Tommy still shaking with rage and grief. Sterling struggled to his feet, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, his carefully styled hair disheveled. For the first time in decades he looked human instead of corporate. "You want me to see what I've done? Fine. I see it." His voice cracked with emotion he'd buried for years. "You want me to acknowledge the damage? I acknowledge it. Every layoff. Every denied claim. Every family destroyed by decisions I made from boardrooms 1,000 miles away." He turned to face Maribel and tears, actual tears, ran down his face. "Your husband Miguel. I remember signing that policy revision. Experimental treatments became code for too expensive to matter. I told myself we were preventing fraud, protecting shareholder value. I killed him with a pen stroke and never lost a minute of sleep." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Marcus, your father Antonio, I remember the Hartford closure too. Celebrated it at a board meeting. 18% profit increase. Shareholders loved it. Never thought about the 400 families whose lives I was ending. They were numbers on a spreadsheet, not human beings with mortgages and children and dreams." Sterling's voice grew stronger as he continued his confession. "Tommy, your father's injury, I personally approved the subcontractor loophole that denied him coverage. Saved the company millions in liability costs. Let him die in poverty to protect our profit margins." Each admission was a knife in his own chest, but Sterling couldn't stop. 30 years of buried guilt was pouring out like blood from a severed artery. "Elena, your homeland's violence, I knew what my shipping operations were really transporting. Turned a blind eye because the money was too good to refuse. Cartel cash funded the war your family fled from." He turned back to Cashin, his former partner who'd orchestrated this night of reckoning. "And you, Cashin. My oldest friend. My most trusted ally. When the Meridian investigation got too close, I fed them your name without hesitation. 25 years of your life to buy my freedom. Your marriage, your daughter, your reputation, all sacrificed on the altar of Sterling Vale's survival." The silence was deafening. "So yes, I'm guilty. Guilty of every charge. Every death. Every broken family. Every shattered dream." Sterling's voice dropped to a whisper. "I built my empire on the bones of innocence and told myself it was just business." He walked toward Cashin, his hands raised in surrender. "You want justice? Take it. Take everything. My money, my companies, my life, All of it. But let them go. He gestured toward Maribel and Elena. They've suffered enough because of me. End this with me. Cashin stared at his former partner in stunned silence. He'd expected denial, bargaining, desperate attempts to shift blame. He hadn't expected complete capitulation, total acknowledgement of guilt. You think dying makes you noble? Cashin asked, but his voice lacked its earlier venom. No, Sterling replied quietly. I think dying makes me accountable. For the first time in my life, I'm taking responsibility for what I've done instead of hiding behind lawyers and money. He knelt in front of Maribel, this woman who'd shown him what courage actually looked like. I can't bring Miguel back. Can't undo the pain. Can't erase the damage. But I can stop adding to it. He looked up at her bleeding face, this angel who'd sacrificed herself for a devil. I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, because I was wrong. Because I chose money over humanity. Because I became a monster and convinced myself I was a businessman. The most powerful man in America knelt before his maid, finally understanding the difference between wealth and worth. Cashin stared down at his kneeling former partner for a long moment, his weapon trembling in his grip. 8 years of planning had led to this moment. Sterling veil broken, confessing, begging for the mercy he'd never shown others. It should have felt like victory. Instead it felt empty. Get up, Cashin said quietly. Sterling remained kneeling. I deserve whatever you... I said get up. Cashin's voice cracked like a whip. You don't get to play martyr now. Not after 30 years of being a monster. Sterling slowly rose to his feet, confusion replacing resignation on his face. This wasn't how he'd expected his execution to proceed. Cashin began pacing, his weapon still trained on the group but his attention focused inward, wrestling with something that made his jaw clench and unclench. You know what the worst part of prison was? He asked, his voice distant. Not the violence. Not the isolation. Not even watching my daughter grow up through letters that came less and less frequently. He stopped pacing and fixed Sterling with a stare that could have melted steel. The worst part was becoming like you. Spending 8 years planning revenge, recruiting broken men to help me hurt you back. Turning into the same kind of monster that destroyed my life. His laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. Congratulations, Sterling. You didn't just steal my freedom, you stole my soul. Marcus stepped forward, confusion written across his young face. What are you saying? We came here for justice. For our families. Justice? Cashin turned on him with fury that made Marcus step backward. This isn't justice, it's just more destruction. More families traumatized. More lives ruined by violence. He gestured toward Elena, still cowering in the corner. Look at that girl. Look what we've done to her. How is terrorizing innocents any different from what Sterling did to us? The question hung in the air like smoke. Tommy's weapon wavered. But he killed my father. Destroyed my family. And killing him brings your father back? Or does it just make you a killer too? Cashin's voice carried the weight of 8 years' worth of soul-searching. We came here to make Sterling face his victims. Mission accomplished. He knows what he is now. Question is, do we? He walked to the window, staring out at the grounds where this had all begun hours earlier. Prison taught me something else, boys. Revenge is a poison that kills the person drinking it. I've spent 8 years swallowing that poison, and it's eaten me alive from the inside. Cashin turned back to face Sterling, his decision crystallizing in his gray eyes. Here's what's going to happen. We're walking away. All of us. Tonight ends here. That's it. Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. After everything he's done? After what he cost us? After everything he's done, we're going to be better than he was. Cashin's voice carried finality that brooked no argument. We're going to choose humanity over revenge. Mercy over justice. Healing over hatred. He stepped close to Sterling, close enough that their faces were inches apart. But understand this, Sterling, tonight was your free pass. Your warning shot. Your last chance to become human before the universe decides you're beyond saving. Sterling nodded frantically, tears still streaming down his face. You're going to liquidate your empire. Every company, every asset, every investment. You're going to set up victim compensation funds, real ones, not tax shelters. You're going to spend whatever years you have left trying to undo some of the damage you've caused. Cashin's smile was sharp as a blade. And if I ever hear that you've gone back to your old ways, that you've hurt another family for profit, that you've forgotten what you learned tonight." He let the threat hang unfinished. "I won't," Sterling whispered. "I swear on Miguel's grave I won't." "Good. Because next time there won't be a Maribel to save you. Next time there won't be mercy." Cashin stepped back, his weapon finally lowering. "Next time I won't talk myself out of pulling this trigger." He gestured to Marcus and Tommy. "We're leaving. Now." As they moved toward the door, Cashin paused one final time. "Your soul was the most expensive thing you never thought to protect, Sterling. Tonight you got to keep it. Don't waste the gift." The three men disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a shattered billionaire, a bleeding hero and a terrified girl. And the echo of a warning that would haunt Sterling Vale for the rest of his life. Some debts could only be paid with transformation. The question was whether Sterling had the courage to pay that price. The sound of the closing door echoed through the mansion like a gunshot in reverse, not the explosion of violence but its sudden, deafening absence. Sterling stood frozen in his study, surrounded by the wreckage of his former life. Overturned furniture. Broken glass. Blood drops on marble floors that had never known real pain before tonight. But the silence was heaviest of all. For 30 years, Sterling's world had been filled with noise, ringing phones, clicking keyboards, the constant hum of an empire demanding attention. Conference calls and board meetings and the endless chatter of people who needed things from him. Now, in the aftermath of near death, the quiet felt apocalyptic. Maribel moved first, her practical nature cutting through the shock like a blade through fog. She walked to Elena, who was still huddled in the corner, and gently helped the young woman to her feet. "It's over, Mija," Maribel whispered, her voice soft despite her split lip and bloodied face. "They're gone. You're safe now." Elena collapsed against Maribel's shoulder, sobs racking her thin frame as 3 hours of terror finally found release. The girl who'd been making tomorrow's meals when the lights went out had witnessed horrors that would reshape her dreams for years to come. All because she'd taken a job in Sterling Vale's house. Sterling watched this tender moment, one woman comforting another, and felt something crack in his chest. When had he last offered comfort to another human being? When had he last considered someone else's pain more important than his own convenience? The answer was never. "We should call the police," Elena whispered through her tears, her voice muffled against Maribel's shoulder. "No," Sterling said quietly. Both women turned to look at him with surprise. "Mr. Vale," Maribel began, but he held up his hand. "They were right. About everything. About me. About what I've done." His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, vulnerable, uncertain, human. "Calling the police won't change that. It'll just add more pain to pain that's already been caused." He walked to his liquor cabinet, the one Marcus and his friends hadn't bothered to touch, and poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey that tasted like ash in his mouth. "Besides, what would I tell them? That 3 men held me accountable for my crimes? That they forced me to see the faces of people I'd destroyed? That they gave me a chance to become human again instead of killing me like I deserved?" Maribel studied his face, looking for traces of the arrogant billionaire who'd dismissed her warnings just hours ago. That man seemed to have died in the confrontation, leaving behind someone she didn't recognize, broken, guilty, but possibly capable of growth. "So what happens now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sterling set down his untouched glass and looked at the 2 women who'd survived the night because of each other's courage. "Now I try to figure out how to become someone worth saving." The mansion's silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of transformation that might be too little, too late. But for the first time in 30 years, Sterling Vale was willing to try. By morning, the mansion buzzed with whispers that traveled faster than wildfire. The groundskeeper arrived at dawn to find the front door hanging open, its electronic locks fried by the power surge. Police tape should have surrounded the property. Ambulances should have been rushing to the scene. Instead, he found Sterling Vale sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee while Maribel cleaned bloodstains from marble floors. No report had been filed. No investigation launched. No arrests made. But the staff knew something extraordinary had happened. Elena's red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands told part of the story. The overturned furniture in Sterling's study whispered more. But it was Maribel, moving through her duties with split lips and bruised knuckles, who became the focus of every hushed conversation. She stood up to them, Elena told the cook in rapid Spanish, her voice filled with awe and residual terror. Armed men with guns, and she stood between them and us like a guardian angel. The cook's eyes widened. Maribel Rodriguez, quiet, invisible Maribel who folded laundry and served meals, had faced down killers? Mr. Vale was on the floor, crying like a baby, Elena continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. But Maribel? She looked them in the eyes and told them to leave the house. No fear. No begging. Just pure courage. By afternoon, the story had spread through the invisible network that connected every mansion, country club and corporate office in Connecticut. The servants' underground railroad of gossip that the wealthy never noticed but always depended upon. Sterling's driver mentioned it to another chauffeur at the gas station. That man told his employer's housekeeper. She whispered it to her sister, who cleaned for a Fortune 500 CEO. Within hours, the entire servant class was talking about the night Maribel Rodriguez became a legend. But Sterling saw the change differently. He watched Maribel move through his house. The same tasks, the same quiet efficiency, but everything felt transformed. When she served his lunch, he noticed the grace in her movements. When she answered his questions, he heard the intelligence in her responses. When she looked at him, he saw the moral authority that had always been there, invisible to his willfully blind eyes. "How long have I been living with a stranger?" he asked her that evening, finding her in the kitchen as she prepared to leave. Maribel paused in gathering her things. "You haven't been living with anyone, Mr. Vale. You've been existing next to people you refused to see." The words stung because they were true. The woman who faced down those men, where did she come from? She was always here. Maribel's voice was gentle but firm. "Emergency room nurse for 8 years before I started working for you. Crisis counselor at the community center. Volunteer firefighter for 6 months until my back gave out. Some people run toward danger because someone has to." Sterling stared at her in amazement. "Why didn't I know any of this?" "Because you never asked." She picked up her purse and moved toward the door. "You never cared who I was before I started cleaning your house. You never wondered who I am after I leave." He watched her walk away, this woman who'd saved his life while he'd spent 3 years treating her like expensive furniture. The servants were whispering about Maribel's courage. Sterling was finally learning to see her humanity. The question was whether he'd learned it too late to matter. Sterling Vale had never made his own bed. At 52 years old, the man who controlled billions in assets stood in his master bedroom at 7 a.m., staring at rumpled sheets like they were a foreign language. His housekeeper wouldn't arrive for another hour. The maid service came on Wednesdays. For the first time since college, he was alone with his own mess. He pulled at the fitted sheet, trying to remember how corners worked. The fabric bunched and twisted under his inexperienced hands. After 10 minutes of struggle, he managed something that vaguely resembled order, wrinkled, uneven but honest effort. It was pathetic. And somehow, it felt like the most important thing he'd done in years. Downstairs, Sterling attempted breakfast. Not ordering breakfast or having it prepared, actually making it. Scrambled eggs turned rubbery in the pan. Toast burned while he wrestled with the coffee machine. The simple meal that Maribel could have prepared perfectly in 5 minutes took him 40. But he ate every bite, tasting failure and humility in equal measure. When Maribel arrived at her usual time, she found Sterling in the kitchen, cleaning his own dishes. "Mr. Vale?" Her voice carried concern and confusion. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm trying to remember what normal feels like." He held up a dish towel like evidence of his transformation. "Turns out I don't know how to do anything useful." Maribel watched him dry a coffee mug with the careful attention of someone performing surgery. His movements were clumsy but determined, like a child learning to walk. "Where's Elena?" she asked, noticing the young woman's absence. Sterling's face fell. "She quit. This morning. Sent a text message. Said she couldn't work here anymore after." He gestured vaguely at the air, unable to name the previous night's trauma. Another casualty. Another life disrupted by the violence that followed him like shadows. "I don't blame her," Sterling continued, his voice heavy with guilt. "She's 19. Should be worried about college exams, not whether her boss is going to get her killed." Maribel studied his face, looking for traces of the old arrogance, the quick solutions, the assumption that money could fix everything. Instead, she found something she'd never seen before in Sterling Vale's features. Genuine remorse. "So what are you going to do?" she asked. Sterling set down the dish towel and looked at his hands, soft, manicured, never calloused by real work. "I don't know. Learn, I guess. Figure out how to be a person instead of just a bank account with opinions." He met her gaze directly for the first time in 3 years of employment. "Will you help me?" The question hung between them, weighted with the possibility of redemption or the certainty of failure. Maribel had spent her life helping broken people heal. The question was whether Sterling Vale could be saved, or whether some damage ran too deep for even her patient hands to mend. Time would tell. But for the first time he was asking the right questions. 6 months later, Sterling Vale stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia Business School, facing an audience that had come to witness either redemption or the most elaborate con job in corporate history. The man at the podium looked different. Thinner, grayer, wearing a simple navy suit instead of the $5,000 Italian armor that had once defined his image. But it was his eyes that told the real story, haunted, uncertain, carrying weight that money couldn't lift. "My name is Sterling Vale," he began, his voice steady but stripped of its former arrogance. "And I'm here to tell you about the night I learned the difference between wealth and worth." The audience shifted uncomfortably. They'd come expecting a typical CEO speech about market dynamics and growth strategies. Instead, Sterling began telling them about Miguel Rodriguez's death, about Antonio's suicide, about families destroyed by spreadsheet calculations and children orphaned by profit margins. "I spent 30 years building an empire on other people's graves," he continued, his confession echoing through the silent auditorium. "Tonight, I want to talk about what it costs to bury your own humanity." In the back row, Maribel Rodriguez sat quietly, watching the man she'd helped transform, or thought she had. Beside her, Sophia squeezed her mother's hand, both women studying Sterling's performance with the careful attention of people who'd learned not to trust easily. "6 months ago, I liquidated my holdings," Sterling announced, causing a ripple of shock through the business students. $40 billion distributed to victim compensation funds, medical research and community rebuilding programs. Every company sold. Every asset converted to help the families my empire had destroyed. The applause was scattered, uncertain. Was this genuine transformation or calculated image rehabilitation? Sterling seemed to read their skepticism. "I know what you're thinking. Is this real? Or is this just another wealthy man buying forgiveness with charitable donations?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "I ask myself the same question every morning." He walked closer to the audience, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Change isn't a press conference or a charitable foundation or a moment of dramatic revelation. Change is getting up every day and choosing to be different than you were yesterday. It's learning to make your own bed when you've had servants your entire adult life. It's looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger you're still learning to like." Sterling's eyes found Maribel in the crowd, and for a moment, something passed between them. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or a shared understanding of how far they'd both traveled from that night of violence and revelation. "Some of you will leave here thinking I'm a reformed man," Sterling continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "Others will see this as an elaborate performance designed to rehabilitate my reputation. The truth is, I don't know which one you're looking at either." He returned to the podium, gripping its edges like an anchor. "What I do know is this. The man who stood in that mansion 6 months ago was a monster who'd forgotten he was human. The man standing before you today is trying to remember what humanity looks like. Whether that makes me redeemed or just a more sophisticated kind of broken." Sterling's voice trailed off, leaving the question unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "I guess we'll find out together." The applause that followed was polite but uncertain, the sound of people witnessing something they couldn't quite categorize as triumph or tragedy. In the back row, Maribel Rodriguez watched the man she'd saved and wondered if she'd rescued a soul or simply taught a better class of devil how to disguise its horns. Time would tell. It always did.